The cold was a constant companion, a creature with teeth that gnawed at the bones of her fingers and toes. Alara knelt on the flagstones, the wet rag in her hands leaving a smear of gray slush in its wake. Each scrub sent a jolt of icy pain from her raw knuckles up to her aching shoulders. She was nothing. Less than nothing. A ghost haunting the edges of the Blackwood pack, tasked with the chores no one else wanted. Her stomach was a hollow, aching pit. The others had eaten hours ago, their laughter echoing from the great hall while she was sent to scour the entryway, a punishment for being slow, for being in the way, for simply existing. Worthless. The word was a brand on her soul, whispered in the corridors and spat at her feet. She was an orphan, a stray taken in out of some long-forgotten pity after her own small pack was decimated by a rogue plague years ago. They never let her forget it. She was a burden, a mouth to feed that offered nothing in return. She had no rank, no family, no worth. Omega, the lowest of the low. A sharp kick landed squarely in her ribs. Alara gasped, curling into herself as pain exploded in her side. She looked up, her vision swimming, into the sneering face of Lyra. "Still slacking, filth?" Lyra's voice was as sharp and cruel as a shard of ice. She was the Alpha's daughter, beautiful and revered, and she despised Alara with a passion that burned cold. "The Supreme Alpha arrives for the conclave tomorrow. This place needs to be spotless, not smeared with your pathetic efforts." Alara gritted her teeth, pushing the wave of nausea down. "I am trying." The words were a bare whisper, stolen by the wind that sliced through the open archway. The wind always felt like it was trying to claw its way inside her, to scoop out what little warmth remained. Lyra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Trying isn't good enough. You are a disgrace to this pack. Father should have left you in the snow to die." Each word was a fresh cut. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the sting of tears. Crying only made it worse. It only ever gave them more satisfaction. She would not break, not completely. This stubborn refusal was the only thing she owned, the single tiny spark of defiance in the vast, cold emptiness of her life. She pushed herself back up, ignoring the throbbing in her side, and dipped the rag back into the freezing bucket. The water bit at her skin, a familiar agony. She focused on it, on the physical pain, because it was easier to bear than the crushing weight of Lyra's hatred. "Get it done," Lyra snapped, before turning and sweeping back towards the warmth of the great hall, her cloak swirling behind her like a shadow. Alara was left alone again with the wind and the cold. She scrubbed harder, the repetitive motion a grim sort of prayer. Maybe, if she worked hard enough, she could scour away the filth of her own existence. Maybe she could become so small, so invisible, that they would finally forget she was there at all. It was a fool's hope, she knew. They never forgot. They enjoyed remembering far too much. The thought of the Supreme Alpha's arrival sent a tremor of fear through her. A leader of his stature, the Alpha King of all packs, would never deign to notice a creature like her. But his presence meant more work, more scrutiny, more chances to fail and be punished. It meant the entire keep would be wound tight as a drum, and she would be the one beaten if the rhythm faltered. She finished the entryway as the last of the weak winter light bled from the sky, leaving the world in shades of deep blue and black. Her hands were numb, clumsy claws of raw flesh. Her side was a constant, deep ache. She hauled the heavy bucket outside to dump it, the icy water splashing against the frozen ground with a dull crackle. As she turned to go back inside, Lyra appeared in the doorway again, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "I have another task for you." Alara's heart sank. She just wanted to crawl into her tiny cot in the servant's cellar and embrace the oblivion of sleep. Old Man Hemlock's winter rot balm. He's run out, Lyra said, her tone deceptively sweet. You're to go to his cabin and fetch a new pot. Now. A protest died on Alara's lips. Hemlock's cabin was a 2-mile trek through the woods. The sun had set. A storm was brewing. She could smell it on the air, a sharp, metallic scent like blood and ozone. It was a death sentence. But the storm, Alara whispered, her voice trembling. Lyra's smile widened. Then you had better hurry, shouldn't you? She tossed a thin, threadbare cloak at Alara's feet. It was barely enough to ward off a summer breeze, let alone a winter gale. Don't come back without it! The heavy oak door slammed shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the sudden, profound silence. She was locked out, abandoned to the coming fury of the sky. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced her more deeply than the wind. This was it. This was how she would die. Not in a glorious battle, not of old age, but frozen and alone in the dark because she was an inconvenience. The thought was so bleak it was almost peaceful. But then that stubborn spark flickered again. No, she would not give Lyra the satisfaction. She would not die. She would walk. She would get the bomb and she would bring it back, and she would survive just to spite the woman who wanted her gone. Wrapping the pitiful cloak around her shoulders, Alara turned her face toward the whispering darkness of the forest and took the first step. The wind immediately sliced at her cheeks like razors, and the first flakes of snow began to fall, melting against her skin like icy tears. The forest was a place of deep shadows and menacing shapes. Every rustle of leaves was a predator, every snap of a twig a threat. The snow began to fall faster, thicker, a blinding white curtain that stole the path from her feet. The world narrowed to the space of her next breath, the next agonizing step through the deepening drifts. She lost all sense of time. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It had sunk into her marrow. It was a living entity, whispering promises of a long, peaceful sleep. Her movements became clumsy, her thoughts sluggish. The spark of defiance that had propelled her was guttering, smothered by the overwhelming, suffocating white. Was this it? Was this the end of her pathetic struggle? Her foot caught on an unseen root, and she pitched forward, landing face first in a deep drift. The snow was soft, almost welcoming. It would be so easy to just lie here, to close her eyes and let the cold take her. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. She clawed her way back to her knees, gasping, her lungs burning. She had to keep moving. She had to. But when she looked up, she saw not the familiar woods, but the edge of a steep, rocky ravine she did not recognize. She had wandered far off the path. Panic, sharp and hot, flared in her chest, a stark contrast to the encroaching frost. She tried to back away, but her feet were numb, unresponsive lumps of ice. She stumbled again, her balance gone. For a horrifying, weightless moment, she was airborne. Then, she was falling. The world was a blur of white and black, the scream tearing from her throat, only to be swallowed by the wind. She hit a snow-covered ledge with a jarring impact that knocked the air from her lungs, then tumbled again, rolling down a steep incline. She came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, her body a symphony of pain, half buried in the snow. For a moment, there was only the ringing in her ears and the muffled howl of the blizzard above. This was it. Truly. There was no getting up from this. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a hot, sticky wetness was seeping through her trousers. Blood. A low growl rumbled through the snow, vibrating against her cheek. It was deep, guttural, and close. Too close. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified drum. A rogue. Or a winter wolf, maddened by hunger. She was going to be torn apart. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. Through the swirling curtain of snow, she saw it. A wolf. But it was no ordinary wolf. It was immense, a creature of midnight and shadow, its shoulders as broad as a man's. Its fur was the color of jet, dusted with snow, and its eyes glowed with a faint internal light, the color of amber in the gloom. It was not looking at her with hunger. It was looking at her with an unnerving, intelligent focus. And it was hurt. One of its massive forelegs was caught in the cruel metal jaws of a hunter's trap, the chain bolted to the rock face. Silver. She could smell the acrid, burning scent of it even through the storm. It was a trap meant for one of her kind, for a shifter. The wolf whined, a low, pained sound, and tugged uselessly at the chain. Its amber eyes met hers again, and in their depths she saw not a beast, but a desperate, trapped intelligence, an appeal. Fear warred with a sudden, inexplicable wave of empathy. He was like her, trapped, in pain, alone. The world had abandoned him here to die, just as it had abandoned her. What was she doing? This was a predator, a massive, powerful shifter who could kill her with a single bite. Her instinct screamed at her to play dead, to hide. But her heart, the foolish, stubborn thing, ached with a sorrow that was not entirely her own. Ignoring the fire in her own broken body, she began to drag herself toward him. Each movement was agony. The snow soaked through her thin clothes, stealing what little body heat she had left. "Easy," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. I want to help." The wolf stilled, its head cocked. It watched her painful progress, the low growl in its chest softening to a questioning rumble. It did not snarl. It did not lunge. It simply watched her, its glowing eyes holding an expression she could not decipher. It looked like waiting. She finally reached him, collapsing in the snow beside the trap. Her breath came in ragged, steaming clouds. Up close, he was even larger, radiating a faint warmth that contrasted with the deathly chill of the air. The smell of pine and winter storms clung to his fur, mingled with the sharp, sickening scent of his blood and the burn of the silver. The trap was a brutal piece of work, its teeth sunk deep into his leg. The silver was visibly searing his flesh, preventing his natural healing from kicking in. He would die here if he was not freed. "I'm going to try," she said, more to herself than to the wolf. Her fingers were numb, useless. She fumbled with the release mechanism, her vision blurring in and out of focus. The metal was frozen, refusing to budge. It was hopeless. She was too weak, too cold. The wolf nudged her hand with its great head, a surprisingly gentle gesture. Its amber eyes bored into hers, and she felt a surge of something that was not her own, a desperate plea, a command. Try again. She took a shaky breath and placed both her hands on the cold steel of the trap. She had to focus. She had to ignore the pain in her leg, the cold seeping into her core, the utter hopelessness of her situation. She had to help him. She did not know why. She just knew she had to. Her bare palm slipped, making direct contact with the wolf's bloodied fur, right beside the silver trap. A bolt of pure lightning shot up her arm. It was not a shock of static electricity, but a cataclysmic surge of raw power. White-hot energy flooded her veins, a fire that burned away the cold and the pain and the fear. Her entire world exploded into blinding light. A scream was ripped from her lungs, a sound of both agony and awe. Searing heat blossomed on the inside of her wrist. It felt as if a star had been born on her skin, branding her to the bone. Through the blinding light in her mind, she felt a connection snap into place, a cord of shimmering energy that tied her to the great wolf, binding her very soul to his. The wolf threw its head back and let out a howl that was not a howl, but a roar of triumph and recognition and pain. The sound shook the ravine, echoing with a power that seemed to silence the storm itself. Then, as quickly as it began, the light receded. Alara lay gasping in the snow, her body trembling uncontrollably. She stared at her wrist. There, etched onto her pale skin in lines of faint, glowing silver gold, was a mark. It was a perfect, stylized star, intricate and beautiful, pulsing with a soft internal light. What was happening to me? She looked up at the wolf. The creature was gone. In its place, kneeling in the snow, was a man. He was magnificent and terrifying, larger than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the storm. His hair was a wild mane of jet black, dusted with snow. He was bare-chested despite the cold, his skin covered in ancient, swirling tattoos that seemed to move in the dim light. A jagged, bleeding wound marred his leg where the trap had been, but he paid it no mind. His face was all harsh angles and predatory beauty, a face carved from granite and fury. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the same eyes as the wolf, but now they blazed with an intensity that was wholly human. They were the color of molten gold, and they were fixed on her with an expression of such profound, possessive awe that it stole the breath from her lungs. He reached out, his large hand impossibly gentle as he cupped her cheek. His touch was electric, sending another, softer jolt of warmth through her. "You're her," he breathed, his voice a low, deep rumble that vibrated through her entire being. It was not a question. It was a statement of absolute, unshakable fact. You are finally here. Alara stared at him, her mind a maelstrom of confusion and terror. The man from the wolf, the glowing mark, the impossible connection she felt humming between them, a tangible thing in the air. This was a dream, a hallucination brought on by the cold and the pain. It had to be. She tried to scramble away, a pathetic animal instinct to flee. A strangled sob escaped her lips. What are you?" His golden eyes softened, but the possessiveness in them only deepened. He moved with a speed that was not human, closing the distance between them in an instant. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all. The contact was overwhelming. His skin was blazing hot, a furnace against her frozen body. The scent of pine and storms was even stronger on him, a wild, intoxicating aroma that made her head swim. "I am Kale," he said, his voice deep as thunder, resonating against her ear. "And you?" He paused, his gaze dropping to the glowing star on her wrist, then back to her face. Are mine. Mine. The word echoed in the deepest parts of her. It was not a threat. It was a promise, a claim, a declaration that changed the very fabric of her reality. Her body, the traitor, relaxed against him, soaking in his impossible warmth, instinctively recognizing a safety she had never known. But her mind recoiled in sheer panic. This was the supreme alpha, the Alpha King, Kale, the man the entire territory was preparing for, and she, a worthless Omega, was cradled in his arms with a magical brand on her skin that tied her to him. No, she whispered, the denial weak, pathetic. She pushed against his chest, a futile gesture. It was like pushing against a mountain. There's a mistake. I'm nobody. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure negation. You are not nobody. His grip tightened, not painfully, but with an unyielding certainty. He looked down at her, his molten gold eyes searing into hers. You are everything. I have waited for you for centuries. Centuries. The word made no sense. Her world was small, brutal, and short. It consisted of cold floors and cruel words. It did not contain ancient kings and soul marks and men who turned into wolves. Sit down, he commanded, his voice soft but absolute. He carried her to the relative shelter of a rocky overhang and gently set her on a dry patch of stone. The sudden loss of his heat was immediate and sharp. She shivered, pulling the thin cloak tighter around herself. Kale ignored his own bleeding leg. His focus was entirely on her. He knelt before her, his gaze dropping to her twisted ankle, which was already swelling to a grotesque size. With an infinite gentleness that seemed at odds with his immense power, he took her foot in his hands. This will hurt, he said, his voice losing none of its command. Before she could protest, he reset the bone with a swift, expert twist. Pain, white-hot and blinding, lanced up her leg. She cried out, arching back against the rock. Tears she had refused to shed for Lyra now streamed freely down her face, born of shock and agony. Shh, Kale soothed, his thumb stroking the top of her foot. A strange warmth spread from his touch, chasing the sharpest edges of the pain away, leaving a dull, manageable throb. I have you. It is done. He ripped a strip of cloth from his own trousers and began to bind her ankle with surprising skill. He worked in silence, his complete attention on the task. Alara watched him through her tears, her heart hammering a frantic, confused rhythm. He was the Alpha King. He commanded legions. He ruled continents. And he was kneeling in a snow-filled ravine, tending to her. A girl who was less than dust. It was impossible. None of this could be real. The mark, she whispered, her voice hoarse. She held up her wrist, the glowing star a beacon in the gloom. What is this? Kale finished tying the bandage and looked up, his golden eyes finding the mark. A flicker of something ancient and deeply satisfied crossed his features. It is the soul bond, he said simply. It signifies that you are my mate, my other half, the one I was created for. Mate. The word hung in the air between them, fraught with a meaning she could barely comprehend. Mates were sacred, a bond of destiny. But they were for powerful alphas, for strong, worthy shifters. Not for her. But I can't be, she insisted, shaking her head. The movement made her dizzy. I'm an Omega. I'm worthless. The word came out on a choked sob, the core truth of her existence laid bare before this impossible man. His face hardened instantly. The air grew heavy, charged with a sudden, dangerous energy. Never, he snarled, the sound a chilling echo of the wolf. Say that word again. He leaned closer, his proximity overwhelming her senses. Whoever told you that is a liar. They will answer to me. Fear, potent and primal, shot through her. Not fear of him, but fear for her pack, for Lyra. She had no love for them, but the thought of this man's wrath unleashed upon them was terrifying. Please, she begged, don't. It doesn't matter. It is the only thing that matters, he countered, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. They hurt you. He reached out and brushed a thumb across her cheekbone, just below a faint, yellowing bruise she had gotten from colliding with the doorframe 2 days ago. His touch was feather light, but his eyes blazed with a murderous fire. They will all pay. He pulled his hand away and rose to his feet, his powerful form seeming to fill the small shelter. He looked out at the raging blizzard, his profile grim and determined. The storm is too strong to travel far. We will rest here until it passes. Then I am taking you home. Home. The word was foreign. She had no home. She had a cellar cot, a place to exist, but not a home. Kael seemed to read her thoughts. He turned back to her, his expression softening again. To my home, he clarified. Our home. He gave her a small, almost hesitant smile. It was a startling expression on his harsh face, a crack in the granite that revealed something breathtaking beneath. It was like watching the sunrise for the first time. It has been empty for a very long time. Before she could process this, he began to gather dry wood from the deeper recesses of the overhang with an efficiency that spoke of long experience in the wild. Within minutes, he had a small crackling fire going. The warmth was life itself. It pushed back the encroaching cold and filled their small space with a flickering golden light. He settled across from her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, longing, relief, and a deep, simmering rage. For 500 years I have been alone, he said, his voice quiet, introspective. The bond was a faint whisper, a half-remembered dream. I searched. I waited. I began to believe it was a curse, a phantom promise that would never be fulfilled, that I was destined to be the last of my line, a king with no queen. He looked at her then, and the raw loneliness in his gaze was so profound it made her own heart ache in sympathy. And then I fell into that trap, silver-laced, a fool's mistake letting my guard down so close to a rival pack's territory. I was weakening. I thought I would die there. And then I smelled you. Snow and sorrow and a strength you do not even know you possess. He held out his hand. Your scent. It was like the bond screaming my name. And when you touched me, he trailed off, his eyes dropping to her wrist again. The universe corrected itself. Alara hugged her knees to her chest, trying to absorb his words. It was too much. A fairy tale, a myth, and she was somehow at the center of it. The worthless girl was the long-lost queen. It was a joke, a cruel, elaborate dream from which she would soon wake, cold and alone on the flagstones. But the fire was real. The pain in her ankle was real. And the massive, golden-eyed king watching her as if she were the most precious thing in all existence was terrifyingly, undeniably real. As the hours passed, the blizzard raged outside their sanctuary, a wild beast howling to get in. Cale kept the fire fed. He did not press her for more conversation, content to simply watch her. The intensity of his gaze should have been unnerving, but strangely, it was not. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, truly seen. Not as a burden or a nuisance, but as a person. Her exhaustion finally began to outweigh her fear and confusion. Her eyelids grew heavy, her head nodding forward. "Sleep," Cale's deep voice commanded softly. "I will watch over you. No one will harm you again." It was a promise spoken with the weight of mountains and the certainty of tides, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Alara believed it. She curled up on the hard stone, facing the fire, and let the darkness claim her. Her last conscious thought was of his golden eyes, standing guard in the flickering light. A sharp, venomous thought broke the quiet of the forest long after the blizzard had passed. Lyra stormed through the snow-laden trees, her fine, fur-lined cloak snagging on branches. That useless Omega filth had not returned. She had likely frozen to death in a ditch somewhere, and good riddance. But she had not brought back the balm, which meant Lyra herself had been forced to endure Old Man Hemlock's complaining this morning. It was the principle of the thing. The creature was supposed to obey. Its failure was an insult. Lyra followed the faint, half-buried tracks, intending to find the girl's frozen corpse and drag it back as proof of her insolence. The tracks led her far off the path, down into a steep, treacherous ravine. Annoyance warred with a grim satisfaction. The fool had fallen. Served her right. Lyra carefully made her way down the slope. At the bottom, she saw signs of a recent camp. A circle of blackened stones and ash from a fire, and 2 sets of tracks leading away, deeper into the wilderness. One was small, limping. The other was large, the prints deep and heavy. Her brow furrowed. Alara had met someone? A rogue, perhaps? Lyra's lip curled. The little tramp was probably shacked up with some mangy outcast. The thought filled her with disgust. She followed the tracks, her anger growing with every step. She would find them. She would drag Alara back by the hair and have her publicly flogged for her disobedience and depravity. The tracks led to a small, hidden cave, partially obscured by a fall of rock and snow. Lyra crept closer, her senses on high alert. A low murmur of voices came from within. One was Alara's, soft and hesitant. The other was a man's, a deep, resonant rumble that made the hairs on her arms stand up. It was a voice of command, a voice of power. She peeked through a narrow crack in the rock. What she saw made her blood run cold. Alara was sitting by a small fire, her ankle neatly bandaged, and with her was the Supreme Alpha, Cale. He was leaning toward Alara, his expression one of utter adoration as he tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Lyra felt a dizzying wave of disbelief, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated jealousy that was so intense it was nauseating. The Supreme Alpha, with that worthless, filthy Omega? How? Why? And then she saw it. As Cale's hand retreated, Lyra caught a glimpse of Alara's wrist in the firelight. It was marked, a glowing, intricate brand that pulsed with a soft, otherworldly light. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She was no expert in ancient lore, but every shifter knew the legends. The soul bond, the fated mate of a Supreme Alpha. It was impossible. A cosmic error, a blasphemy. That mark, that honor, that power, it belonged to someone like her, someone of high birth, of pure lineage, not to the dirt beneath her feet. The jealousy curdled into something colder and more calculating. This was not just an insult. It was an opportunity. An Omega whelp, even one with the king's mark, was a weakness, a liability. There were factions, whispers in the shadows, of those who felt Kale's long reign had made him complacent, those who coveted his throne. Men like Lord Morrow, the ambitious leader from the Shadowfell pack, a man whose dark reputation was known to all. Morrow and his Ember Covenant would pay handsomely for this information. They would pay even more for the girl herself. A fated mate was a king's greatest strength, but a captured mate. She was a weapon that could be used against him, a key to his undoing. Lyra backed away from the cave, her heart pounding with a venomous thrill. Her personal spite had just intersected with high treason. She could destroy Alara and gain favor with a potential new king all at once. She turned and fled back through the forest, her mind racing. She forgot all about the balm, about her petty grievances. She had stumbled upon a secret that could shatter kingdoms, and she was going to use it. Alara's brief, impossible dream of a new life was about to become a nightmare. Kale sensed the shift in the air moments after it happened, a flicker of malice, a scent of jealousy on the wind. He rose to his feet, his golden eyes narrowing as he stared in the direction Lyra had fled. "What is it?" Alara asked, her voice timid. "Someone was watching us," he said, his tone flat and dangerous. "They are gone now." He turned back to her, the hardness in his face melting away as he looked at her. "It does not matter. We leave now. I will not have you linger in these lands a moment longer." He extinguished the fire and, without a word of warning, swept her into his arms again. Alara gasped, but did not protest. Being held by him already felt more natural than standing on her own 2 feet. "Hold on," he murmured against her hair, and then he began to run. The world became a blur of white and green. He moved with a supernatural speed and grace, his powerful legs eating up the miles, his steps nearly silent in the snow. Alara clung to him, burying her face in the warm hollow of his shoulder, overwhelmed by the sheer power of him. This was the Alpha King. Not just a man, but a force of nature. But they were not fast enough. As they broke through the tree line into a wide, open clearing, shadows detached themselves from the surrounding forest. There were at least a dozen of them, clad in dark leather and bearing cruel-looking weapons. Their eyes glowed with a faint, malevolent red light. The Ember Covenant. Kale came to a sudden halt, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. A low, vicious growl tore from his chest. He gently set Alara behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a deadly command. A tall, gaunt figure stepped forward from the group. He had a cruel, aristocratic face and eyes as black and empty as a starless night. He smiled, a thin, bloodless slash in his pale face. "King Kale, an unexpected pleasure. We were told you had a new acquisition." His dead eyes flickered to Alara, who shrank back from the sheer evil radiating from him. This had to be Morrow. "Morrow," Kale snarled. "You have made your last mistake." Morrow's smile widened. "I think not." He gestured with one hand, and his warriors raised their weapons, crossbows loaded with bolts tipped in the telltale gleam of silver. "The girl. Give her to us, and we may let you limp away with your life." "You will die for even suggesting it," Kale promised, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. His hands curled into fists, the tattoos on his arms seeming to writhe and darken. So be it. Morrow gave a sharp nod. The world exploded into chaos. The Covenant warriors attacked, not with the wild fury of a pack fight, but with a cold, disciplined precision. Kale met them head-on. He was a whirlwind of destruction, a blur of motion and raw power. He moved faster than she could track, his fists and feet striking with bone-shattering force. Men went down, their bodies broken, but for every one he felled, 2 more took his place. They were hurting him, using the silver-tipped bolts to keep him off balance, to limit his movements. A bolt grazed his arm, and he roared in pain and fury as the silver sizzled against his skin. He was magnificent, a god of battle, but he was outnumbered and still not at his full strength. Alara watched in horror, her heart lodged in her throat. This was her fault. They were here for her. This powerful, ancient king was being brought low because of her. The crushing weight of her own worthlessness returned with a vengeance. She was a curse, a plague. In the chaos, a shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Before she could scream, a heavy cloth bag was thrown over her head, plunging her into suffocating darkness. Rough hands seized her. She was lifted from her feet, a terrified scream muffled by the thick fabric. "Kale!" she shrieked, her voice lost in the bag. She heard his enraged roar, a sound of pure, world-ending fury. It was followed by the sickening thud of bodies hitting the ground, but then the sound grew more distant. She was being carried away, dragged from the fight. "We have the prize!" a voice shouted. "Fall back!" The last thing she heard was Kael's desperate, furious cry of her name, a sound of such agony that it shattered her heart. Then there was only the jostling motion of being carried and the suffocating darkness. She was a prisoner. The hope that had bloomed in her chest for a few precious hours had been ripped out, leaving a bleeding, gaping wound. Despair, colder and deeper than any winter storm, flooded her. She had found her mate, her king, only to have him torn from her. She was back where she started, alone, in the dark, and utterly, completely worthless. The journey was a blur of rough handling and stifling darkness. Alara was thrown over a shoulder, then into the back of what felt like a wagon. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. When the bag was finally ripped from her head, she found herself in a cold, dark cell. Heavy iron bars separated her from a torchlit corridor. The only furniture was a pile of damp straw in the corner. Her ankle throbbed, a dull counterpoint to the sharp, agonizing ache in her chest. The bond. The separation from Kale was a physical torment. The glowing star on her wrist had faded to a dull gray smudge that felt like a brand of ice against her skin. It was as if a vital part of her had been amputated, leaving a phantom limb that screamed with pain. Through the bond, she could feel him. His rage was a wildfire, a force that could level mountains. But beneath it, there was a current of desperate, gnawing pain that mirrored her own. He was hurt. He was searching. He was fighting. Days bled into one another. Twice a day, a silent guard would shove a wooden bowl of thin, watery gruel and a cup of stale water through the bars. It was sustenance, nothing more. A way to keep the asset alive. The despair was a living thing, a creature that whispered to her in the long, silent hours. It told her she was a fool to have ever hoped. It told her Kale would be better off without her, a worthless omega dragging him into traps and ruin. The walls of her heart, the ones he had started to dismantle, were rebuilding themselves, thicker and higher than ever before. One day, the heavy door at the end of the corridor opened. Footsteps echoed, approaching her cell. It was Morrow. He stood before the bars, his black eyes studying her as if she were an interesting insect. "How is our little queen holding up?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescending mockery. Alara scrambled to the far corner of the cell, pressing herself against the cold, damp stone. She said nothing. Morrow chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Still defiant. I wonder how long that will last. He paced before the bars, his movements like a stalking panther. You are probably wondering why you are here. Why go to all this trouble for a little stray like you? He stopped and leaned in, his face close to the bars. You are the key. An Alpha King's fated mate is the source of his renewal, the anchor for his lineage. The bond flows both ways. Power can be given, but it can also be taken. A cold dread washed over Alara. We have rediscovered an old ritual, Morrow continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A ritual to sever the bond. But it does more than that. It uses the mate as a conduit, a siphon. As we break you, we will drain him. We will take his ancient power, the strength of his entire line, and make it our own. By the time we are done, he will be a husk, and I will be the new Supreme Alpha. He smiled his bloodless smile. And you, my dear, will be the instrument of his destruction. The perfect, tragic irony. The love that was meant to be his salvation will be his doom. You see now, don't you? You truly are worthless to him. Worse than worthless. You are a poison. His words were poison. They sank into her, feeding the despair, validating every terrible thought she had ever had about herself. He was right. She was a weapon aimed at Cale's heart. Her existence would destroy him. Tears streamed down her face. A gut-wrenching sob tore from her chest. This was a pain far worse than any physical blow. This was the agony of the soul. Morrow watched her break, his expression one of deep satisfaction. Good, he said softly. Despair is a crucial ingredient for the ritual. We begin at moonrise. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving her alone with his devastating truth. She curled into a ball on the damp straw, her body racked with sobs. She wished she had died in the snow. She wished Cale had never found her. She wished she had never been born. The pain in the bond intensified, a searing agony. She felt Cale's frantic search, his roaring fury, but it was distant, muffled by her own overwhelming despair. She was going to die. But first, she was going to be used to kill the only person who had ever looked at her with kindness. The one person who had made her feel seen. The weight of it was too much to bear. Her consciousness began to fray at the edges. The darkness in the cell seemed to press in, to swallow her whole. Hold on. The voice was not in her ears, it was in her mind. Deep, resonant, and achingly familiar. It was Cale. Her head snapped up. She was alone in the cell. But the voice had been as clear as if he were standing beside her. Hold on, Alara. I am coming. It was a whisper through the agonizing bond, a thread of light in the suffocating darkness. He was not giving up. He was still fighting for her. A tiny, fragile flicker of hope ignited in the ruins of her heart. It was not much. It was barely anything at all, but it was there. He was coming. She just had to hold on. She didn't know how, but for him, she had to try. The guards came for her as the moon climbed into the night sky. They dragged her from the cell, her feet stumbling on the cold stone. They led her not outside, but deeper into the fortress, down a winding staircase into a vast circular cavern. The air was thick with the smell of incense and something else, something metallic and sinister. The cavern was filled with robed figures, the members of the Ember Covenant, their faces hidden in the shadows of their hoods. In the center of the room, a complex circular array of runes was carved into the floor, glowing with a sickly red light. Moro stood in the center, his arms raised. He was chanting in a guttural, ancient language that made the stones themselves seem to vibrate. Alara was forced to her knees in the middle of the circle. Her arms were pulled taut and chained to 2 stone pillars. She was the centerpiece of their profane ritual, the sacrificial lamb. Moro finished his chant and turned to her, his black eyes glittering. The time is now. The bond will be broken. The king will fall. He placed his hands on her head. A wave of icy, nauseating energy flooded her. It was a violation of the deepest kind, a dark magic that clawed at the edges of the bond, seeking to tear it apart. The pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined. It was the sound of her soul being ripped in 2. She screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. Through the torment, she felt Kael. He roared in her mind, a sound of shared agony and apoplectic rage. The bond was fraying, the connection dimming, being drowned in Moro's dark power. "It is working!" Moro cried, his voice ecstatic. "I can feel his power. It is flowing to me." Despair crashed over Alara again. Kael's voice in her mind was gone, replaced by this overwhelming darkness. She was failing him. He was dying because of her. No. The word rose from a place deeper than despair, a place of pure, primal rage. This man, this monster, was not just killing her. He was hurting Kael. He was taking him from her. He had made her feel hope and then turned it into a weapon. He would not win. At that exact moment, the cavern wall exploded inwards. A shower of rock and dust filled the air as a massive, dark shape smashed through the stone. It was Kael. He was no longer a man, but a terrifying hybrid of man and wolf. His body was larger, his features more bestial, his claws extended and his golden eyes blazing with the light of a dying star. He was a creature of pure, unrestrained wrath. His warriors poured in behind him, a tide of fur and fury, and the cavern erupted into a maelstrom of battle. The Covenant cultists, caught by surprise, were thrown into chaos. Kael saw only 2 things, Moro and the woman he was torturing. With a roar that shook the foundations of the fortress, he launched himself across the cavern. He moved like a thunderbolt, a streak of avenging fury. Cultists who got in his way were swatted aside like flies, their bodies broken and discarded. Moro, his eyes wide with a flicker of fear, shoved Alara forward and raised a hand, blasting Kael with a wave of siphoned dark energy. The blast hit Kael square in the chest, staggering him. He grunted in pain, the stolen power of his own lineage used against him. "You are too late!" Moro shrieked, a manic glee in his voice. "The bond is almost severed. Her weakness has already defeated you." He turned his attention back to Alara, intending to deliver the final, killing blow to the bond. He raised a hand wreathed in black energy, aiming it at her heart. Seeing Kael stumble, seeing that killing energy aimed at her, something inside Alara snapped. The rage, the grief, the desperate, protective love she felt for the king who had shown her kindness. It all coalesced into a single, incandescent point of light within her. The worthless Omega, the curse, the poison, all the labels they had ever put on her burned away in that instant. The dark magic Moro was using was a siphon, but a siphon can work both ways. A wave of pure, brilliant light erupted from her. It was not a gentle glow. It was an explosion. A nova of raw, untamed power that vaporized the chains holding her and blasted outward. The light was searing, holy, and absolute. The red runes on the floor were scoured away, turning to black dust. The robed cultists screamed as the light hit them, not burning them, but purifying them, stripping away Moro's dark influence and leaving them dazed and powerless. The wave of light washed over KL. It sank into his skin, knitting his wounds, purging the dark magic, and refilling him with a strength that was warm and familiar. It was the other half of his own soul, returning to him, magnified and perfected. He stared, his bestial features softening in pure, unadulterated awe. Alara got to her feet. She was no longer a shivering, terrified girl. She was wreathed in a soft, golden-white aura. The star on her wrist burned with the intensity of a real sun. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with that same inner light. Power, ancient and deep, flowed through her veins. It was the power of life, of healing, of light itself. Moro staggered back, shielding his eyes. "What is this? What are you?" he shrieked, his voice filled with disbelief and terror. Alara took a step toward him. The floor cracked beneath her feet. "They called me worthless," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, ringing command that echoed with power. "They called me a curse." She took another step, her light growing brighter, forcing Moro back. "You called me a poison. You were wrong." She looked past him, her eyes meeting Kale's. In his gaze, she saw everything she had ever wanted. Love, acceptance, pride. He was hers. She turned her full attention back to Moro. "I am not worthless," she declared, her voice ringing with the conviction of absolute truth. "I am his queen." She raised a hand. The light of her aura gathered there, concentrating into a sphere of blinding energy. "And he," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, possessive whisper, "is mine." She thrust her hand forward. A beam of pure, concentrated light shot across the cavern and struck Moro. He did not even have time to scream. The light enveloped him, and for a moment he was a silhouette against its brilliance. Then he simply dissolved. Not into ash, but into nothingness. His darkness utterly and completely unmade by her absolute light. Silence fell over the cavern. The remaining cultists were on their knees, disoriented. Kale's warriors stood in stunned silence, their battle won for them. The light around Alara softened, receding back into her until only the star on her wrist and the faint glow in her eyes remained. The immense power left her feeling drained, but clean, whole. She swayed on her feet, the adrenaline fading. Before she could fall, Kale was there. He crossed the cavern in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms, holding her with a desperate, reverent strength. He buried his face in her hair, his whole body trembling. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I have you." She wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him. "I knew you would come," she whispered against his chest. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his golden eyes searching her face. He reached up and cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I almost lost you." The pain in his voice was a physical thing. "You didn't," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We didn't." He looked at the star on her wrist, which was now burning brighter and more beautifully than ever before. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to the mark. A jolt of pure, warm energy flowed from him into her, replenishing her strength. "My queen," he said, his voice filled with a reverence that made her heart soar. As he spoke the words, something incredible happened. A new mark began to form on the back of his own hand, the one that held hers. Lines of shadow and light swirled against his skin, coalescing into a pattern that was the perfect inverse of her own. A black sun, dark and powerful, but with a center that glowed with a faint golden light. Their marks pulsed in unison, a silent declaration. The bond was no longer a one-sided claim. It was a shared covenant, complete. He looked from his mark to hers, then back to her face, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his lips. It was the sunrise again, chasing away all the shadows. "Mine," he said, the word no longer just a claim, but a shared truth. "Yours," she answered, her voice firm, without a trace of the timid girl she had once been. The journey back to Kale's capital, the Silver Spire, was nothing like her flight from the Blackwood Pack. They traveled with a full royal guard, and she rode not in Kale's arms, but on a magnificent white mare beside him. He never let her hand leave his, their newly marked skin a constant, warm connection. When they arrived, the entire city had gathered. Thousands upon thousands of shifters filled the grand plaza before the palace, their faces turned upward in anticipation. As Kale led them onto the high balcony, a hush fell over the crowd. He stood before his people, his arm wrapped securely around Alara's waist. He was every inch the king, powerful and commanding. But when he looked at her, his eyes were filled only with love.
"For centuries, our throne has been half empty!"
Kale's voice boomed across the plaza, amplified by his own power.
"I ruled alone, but the ancient bond has been honored. Destiny has been fulfilled."
He raised their joined hands, showing the twin marks to the assembled masses.
"Behold, Alara, she who was hidden in shadow has come into the light. She who holds the heart of the sun is my fated mate, your queen."
A moment of stunned silence, and then the crowd erupted. A single unified roar of acclamation and joy shook the very stones of the city. Howls and cheers echoed into the sky. They were not just accepting her, they were celebrating her. Alara looked out at the sea of faces, at the thousands of shifters cheering for her. Her, the worthless Omega. Among the dignitaries forced to attend from the surrounding packs, she saw a small contingent from Blackwood. She saw Lyra. Her face was a mask of chalky white disbelief and pure, impotent hatred. Their eyes met for a brief second, and Alara felt nothing. Not fear, not anger, not even triumph, just a distant, clinical pity. Lyra was a part of a life that no longer belonged to her. Alara turned her gaze away from the past and looked up at Kale. He was already looking at her, his golden eyes filled with a love so profound it felt like the center of the universe. The walls she had built around her heart for years, the ones he had begun to dismantle in a snowy ravine, were not just gone. They had been utterly vaporized by the light she now carried inside her. A light he had seen when she couldn't even see it herself. She was not worthless. She was not invisible. She was a queen. She was loved. She was home. Leaning into his strength, surrounded by the roar of her new people, Alara smiled. It was a real smile, bright and full of a future she had never dared to imagine. Her new life was just beginning.